Welcome to China Insider. I'm David Zhang. Xi Jinping landed in Moscow today and met with President Putin. They're trying to hijack international law to challenge the global order. The common goal is to project a version of global order or the lack of global order to the world. From our perspective, anyone would conclude that Putin and Xi are in it together. And I think that the CCP is at a point where they're really going to become clear in terms of the goal, which has always been about toppling the West. Now, I found something quite interesting. It is how Xi and Putin interpret this so-called friendship with each other. To this day, it is unclear if they actually view it in the same way. Now, why do I say this? Prior to Xi landing in Moscow, the two leaders published a respective opinion piece in the country's state media. Putin's piece in China's People's Daily suggests the, quote, no-limit partnership from last year. Quote, Russia-China ties surpass Cold War-time military-political alliances in their quality, with no one to constantly order and no one to constantly obey, without limitations or taboos. Such enthusiasm is not equally admitted in Xi Jinping's piece to the Russian state media. The CCP leader instead focused on, quote, China and Russia are committed to no alliance, no confrontation, and not targeting any third party in developing our ties. Note here that no limit is missing in Xi's version of the text. Now, this is a strong indication that the relationship has always had its distances, especially on the Chinese side. Or rather, who is actually the one that needs the help more? Now, there was a term used to describe this relationship in the past, a marriage of convenience. It's one where Xi Jinping doesn't mind joining, but would like to maximize his benefit. Of course, the main benefit is that Russia's war in Ukraine can help to drain Western finances and to essentially keep the Europeans, and to some degree, certainly the US would be busy with it, so that China could invade Taiwan. Recognizing this strategic value, the CCP focuses on how to navigate around Western sanctions while dancing with the question, is China supporting Russia? If you go to any of its official statements, the Chinese Communist Party would never admit that it is supporting Russia. And it has maintained that there's some distances, albeit in the shadow, sending weapons and aids to support Putin to continue the war. Not revealing its true alliance with Russia largely has to do with avoiding Western sanctions and shifting the main reason Xi is doing this, which again is Taiwan. So after more than a year later, what exactly does the CCP want out of Russia? And does Putin agree with it? Well, Xi has always left room for adjustment in this partnership just in case things go south. At times calling each other friends, as they're now doing, other times slightly distancing to avoid catastrophic consequences, like again, sanctions. Now, Xi Jinping focuses his statement on, quote, China and Russia are committed to no alliance, no confrontation, and not targeting any third party in developing our ties. And that means, at least on paper, the relationship is not aimed at the West, but anyone with fifth grade education would probably see that Russia and China are actually trying to challenge the international order, and doing so binds them together. So it is really clear that despite the CCP saying it is not involved with the Russian war, it is not trying to target a third party, aka the US, while the real intention has always been basically about targeting the West, and in particular the US. The hard part is we have two authoritarian leaders challenging this aspect, and we have to understand where they stand. From the CCP's perspective, they view Russia in a potentially problematic state. Doing too much to help them draws unwanted fire to themselves, yet doing not enough will also cause the boat to flip over. Such dilemma was always there since the beginning. But Russia views itself as a shield against attacks from the US-led free world, and in this great power competition between the US and China, Russia is being used as a pawn to keep the US engaged in Europe, just as Ukraine is being used as a proxy or a pawn for the US. Now, China's plan with Russia becomes very clear. They are ultimately worried about themselves and how to invade Taiwan while the US is distracted. So how to maximize keeping the US engaged in Europe while they make a move on Taiwan is the top question. Does Putin see this as Russia being used for the CCP to achieve that goal? Would he allow China to use himself as a pawn? In my limited knowledge on Russian politics, I would assume that Putin would have his own calculations. And when Xi arrived today, instead of himself or Medvedev, who is the prime minister, or the foreign minister Lavrov, greeting, he actually sent a minister of tourism to greet Xi Jinping. This is clearly a diplomatic game to show Xi that Putin is coming to the negotiation table as an equal, not as the little bro of China. And Putin understands that China is supporting much the needs of Russia to continue the war. And we still have to understand that it was after Xi Jinping's meeting with Putin in early February last year that he then launched the invasion. And Xi has continued to supply arms to help Putin stay in the fight. But no matter how we look at it, there's a need for Xi to support Putin to continue the war, and in doing so, there's some type of dependency. Now, whether that's dependent from Xi to Putin or the other way around, we know that Putin wants Xi to give his 100% support. In fact, I think Putin wants Xi to make it public and clear to the world that Russia and China are in it together. But Putin likely knows that Xi Jinping's agenda for Russia isn't really to help it win against the Ukraine for the sake of friendship. It is to keep, again, purely to keep the US busy. In other words, in the end, whether Putin wins or loses, as long as the CCP doesn't get impacted, there's room for retreat, for Xi at least. But there's clear distance in Xi's version of seeing the China-Russia tie than that of Putin. And again, we said this is to be expected as Russia is trying to keep the CCP on the same boat, and so any damage to the boat will result in both nations suffering. On paper, Xi's first visit to another nation after securing his third term is Russia, and this indicates that to keep the friendship alive with Putin. While at the same time, policy-wise, Xi Jinping wants to make a move in that a way would leave enough room for him to jump ship if things go south. Even if it means they're burning the bridge with Russia, he would still ensure that he is safe himself. In my last episode, I made it clear that the CCP will value its own survival anytime the threat to its existence becomes too big. With that being said, let's actually talk about what both Xi Jinping and Putin would agree on and what they think is the bigger problem than their so-called relationship. First, both Putin and Xi would like to challenge the existing international order, and they've made it clear since the beginning that the root of all problems lies with the Western way of rules. And today, Xi announced that the main goal of his foreign policy is to change the international system by winning power and influence for China and by pushing back on US power and its related pressure on countries to democratize. And Russia agrees that the US influence is the top problem. Now, see Ukraine, for a Putin-led Russia to survive in the world, they have to destroy Ukraine. Both Putin and Xi agree that a quote-unquote new era is the one where the US would cease to influence global decisions, one where hypothetically Russia or China can take charge. Now, this of course inevitably leads to a problem. Would Russia be okay to follow a China-led world order? History tells us that the last time a Russo-Sino alliance was formed during the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party, it ended in the 70s after the Communist China helped then the United States to fight against the Soviet Union. Now, there's a lot to discuss in terms of the fine details, but the point is, Russia knows what history has taught them. The CCP-led world order is not the same as the one where Russia is on top. But at the moment, that's not the big problem. At the moment, confrontation with the US still takes priority. The second part that both Xi and Putin would agree on is the one that a ceasefire must be beneficial to Russia. Putin is ready to negotiate for the invasion in Ukraine, but the terms are also very ridiculous. Ukraine, the US, or anyone would see it and say, hey buddy, that's not really what you want to do. You're not really sincere about this, right? Well, despite what the CCP has put out, its so-called 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, it's all talk and it's very contradictory. Even the Ukrainian officials agree with it. Xi Jinping basically wants to create a 38th parallel-like scenario, like the North and South Korea, and allow Russia to hold on to the regions in Ukraine that it has occupied, including in Crimea. And we know that from the Ukrainian perspective, that's not a peace plan. Giving up the Donbas region, which includes Luhansk and Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, and then also Crimea on top of that, it's already a big concession that no sovereign nation would agree to. Yet Putin's visit to Crimea and Mariupol signals that the plan is that China would support this. In other words, Xi isn't trying to play the role of ending the war, where both sides reset their border back to the beginning and negotiate Crimea in the meantime. What Xi Jinping supports is the annexation of these four regions. Xi Jinping said that China would be ready for Russia to stand guard over the world order based on international law. By supporting Russia's annexation, they've already triumphed over the West in the challenge on the existing international order. It will be further consolidated if somehow the US and Ukraine would agree on the annexation. Of course, we know that they're not going to agree on it. They would never agree to such terms. It undermines the credibility of the entire Western world and of Ukraine itself. Today, Secretary of State Blinken says, quote,
"And a ceasefire now, without a durable solution, would allow President Putin to rest and refit his troops and then restart the war at a time more advantageous to Russia." The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms. Such a move would violate the UN Charter and defy the will of 141 countries.
Now, you could say that the CCP is changing the definition of peacemaker and attempting to change the order of the world. Now, the third agreement, I think, is what Xi can provide to Putin on the continuation of the war. Now, we know that they're supplying guns and armor, drones and ammunition and supplies. These have already happened. The question is, in the next step, what perhaps will define the so-called new era of Russia-China relations is if Xi is ready to make it bigger. Now, I doubt Xi Jinping is ready to make a splash that would draw sanctions, but there are clearly plans to expand their cooperation, especially in how to support Russia better. Now, in the end, we know that in the back of Xi's mind, it's always going to be how to use Russia well to create a problem for the world, and for Putin's mind, it's how to drag China along for the ride. The bottom line is this: both sides are using each other. China wants to present itself as a so-called responsible stakeholder, whereas Russia wants to show that it's not really alone in this. All right, that's it for today's China Insider. I'm David Zhang. We hope you enjoy the content so far. And if you do, make sure to subscribe to our channel, comment below what you think about our topic today, and make sure to like the video to help us grow. All right, thanks so much for watching today. We'll see you next time.